The Dragon Empire was unlike any other in the galaxy. Spanning across countless star systems, it was an empire built on power, wealth, and ancient traditions. And at its heart sat the Dragon Emperor, a ruler so mighty that his name echoed across the cosmos. His scales were the color of molten metal, his eyes burning with the light of 1,000 suns. Yet, for all his strength, the Emperor had become a figure of loneliness and pride. Long ago, the Dragon Emperor had been a ruler beloved by his people. His heart had once been warm, filled with compassion and a desire to protect the empire. But those days were now a distant memory. The Emperor had grown cold, distant, and bitter. For centuries he had received countless gifts, rare gems, pieces of artwork, and artifacts from across the universe. But none of them had ever moved him. No treasure, no token, and no offering could break through the icy barrier he had built around his heart. Each year, representatives from every corner of the galaxy came to present their gifts to the Emperor. They came with the finest jewels, the most expensive fabrics, and the rarest creatures, hoping to win the favor of the Emperor. But every time, without fail, the Emperor would reject their offerings with a simple wave of his hand. No words, no thanks. Just a cold dismissal. Is that all? The Emperor would ask, his voice like thunder as he glanced down at the piles of treasure before him. You think I need this? I do not want your trinkets. I am the Dragon Emperor. The courtiers and ambassadors would leave in silence, their heads bowed in shame, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their gifts had been useless. The Emperor had everything he needed and more. Nothing could impress him. Nothing could touch him. But despite his hardened exterior, rumors of a different emperor lingered in the whispers of the old. They spoke of a time when he was not only strong but kind. They spoke of a time when his heart had been full of love for his people. But those days seemed to have passed. The emperor was no longer the ruler he once was. He was an emperor who had everything, but also nothing. In the capital city of the empire, a place filled with towering spires and shining technology, there lived a young human orphan named Eris. They had no family, no wealth, and no status. Eris had been abandoned as a child during one of the galaxy's many wars, and they had spent their entire life struggling to survive. The streets of the capital were harsh, but Eris had learned to navigate them with ease. They scavenged for food, found shelter in forgotten corners, and watched the grand city from the shadows. Eris had always been fascinated by the Dragon Emperor. They had heard stories of his incredible power and his once glorious reign. Despite the rumors of the Emperor's pride and cruelty, Eris believed that deep down he was still the ruler he had once been. Eris had never met the Emperor, but they saw him from a distance on the massive screens that broadcasted his speeches, or in the grand parades where he would sit on his throne, surrounded by treasures and guards. Eris admired the Emperor's strength and dignity, but also saw the loneliness that seemed to radiate from him. To them, the Emperor was a symbol of something lost, something that could still be saved. One day, news spread across the streets of the capital that the Emperor would hold a grand event for Founders' Day, a celebration of the Dragon Empire's founding. Every year, ambassadors and nobles from all corners of the empire would attend, bringing lavish gifts and making grand speeches in honor of the Emperor. The Emperor would listen, accept the gifts with a cold smile, and dismiss them. It was tradition. But this year, something unusual happened. Eris overheard a conversation in a market. Two merchants were talking about the Emperor's upcoming reception. One of them said, "They say the Emperor won't accept any more gifts this year. He says they all mean nothing to him." Eris felt a pang of sadness. They had always dreamed of giving the Emperor something, anything to show their respect. But if the Emperor was rejecting everything, what hope did they have? That night, as Eris lay awake in the small shelter they had found, they thought about the Emperor's coldness. They thought about how much the Emperor must have lost, how much he must have suffered over the centuries. Power and wealth had not filled the emptiness inside him. Nothing had. Then, an idea came to Eris. It wasn't a grand idea, not a fancy, gift or a rare artifact, but something simple, a thank you card, something small, something personal, something from the heart. Eris didn't have much. They couldn't offer jewels or treasures, but they could offer something no one else had ever thought to give, themselves. Eris found some old scraps of paper, some dried flowers, and a small piece of ribbon they had saved. They carefully folded the paper into a card, writing in the neatest handwriting they could muster. "Thank you for protecting us, even if we have forgotten." Eris stared at the card, wondering if the Emperor would even notice such a simple gesture. Would he care? Would it make a difference? But Eris didn't care. They knew that this was the only gift they could give, and it was the only one that mattered. It wasn't about wealth or power. It was about showing the Emperor that someone still cared, that someone still saw him as more than just a ruler. Eris didn't expect to change the Emperor's heart, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could remind him of something he had forgotten: kindness. The next day, Eris made their way toward the palace. The streets were filled with people, all heading to the grand event. But Eris had no interest in the festivities. They only had one goal: to give the Emperor their card. As they approached the massive gates of the palace, Eris hesitated. What if the guards stopped them? What if they were thrown out? But Eris pushed the fear aside. They had come this far. They would not turn back now. Eris took a deep breath, holding the card tightly in their hands, and stepped forward into the unknown. Eris stood outside the gates of the grand palace, their heart pounding in their chest. The towering walls, made of shining metal and ancient stone, seemed to stretch into the sky, blocking out the sunlight. The palace was a symbol of the Emperor's power, a place where only the richest, most powerful beings in the galaxy were allowed to enter. And here Eris was, a lowly orphan, holding nothing but a small handmade card. The guards at the gate were tall and imposing, their armor gleaming in the light. They stood like statues, their eyes scanning the crowd of people making their way to the palace for the Founders' Day event. Eris knew they didn't belong here, but they also knew they had no other choice. If there was any chance of reaching the Emperor, they would have to push forward. Taking a deep breath, Eris stepped toward the guards. They were nervous, but they couldn't let fear stop them now. The card felt heavy in their hands, almost as if it contained the weight of every hope they had ever held. One of the guards raised an eyebrow as Eris approached. "What is it that you want?" he asked, his voice sharp and cold. Eris swallowed. I have a gift for the Emperor," they said, their voice trembling. "A simple one. A card." The guard looked down at Eris, then at the small folded card in their hands. He snorted, clearly amused. "A card? Do you honestly think the Emperor will accept a child's scribbles?" Eris felt their cheeks burn with embarrassment, but they stood their ground. "It's not just a card. It's a message. A thank you." The guard sneered but didn't move to stop Eris. "You're wasting your time. The Emperor doesn't accept gifts anymore. Go back to wherever you came from." Eris clenched their fists, ready to argue, but just then another guard spoke up. "Let them through," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something about the way she spoke that made the other guard hesitate. The first guard frowned. "But they're just a child." The second guard looked at Eris with a sharp gaze. And sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference. Eris didn't know what to say, but they nodded gratefully. The guard stepped aside, and with a mixture of fear and hope, Eris walked past the gates and into the palace. Inside, the palace was even more magnificent than they had imagined. Tall marble columns stretched high into the sky, and the floors were covered with carpets so soft they felt like clouds beneath their feet. Everywhere Eris looked, there were paintings, sculptures, and treasures from every corner of the galaxy. Works of art, alien creatures in glass cages, and jewels that shimmered like stars. The air smelled faintly of incense and polished metal. It was both beautiful and intimidating, but Eris couldn't be distracted. They had come for one thing: to deliver their card. The halls of the palace were empty, and Eris wandered through them, trying to find their way to the Emperor. They had no idea where he might be, but they knew they had to find him before the event started. The clock was ticking. As they walked, Eris overheard hushed conversations between servants and courtiers. "I hear the Emperor is in a foul mood today," one said. "He's rejected every gift so far." "He's always like that," another replied. No one can ever please him. Eris felt a pang of sadness at the words. The Emperor seemed so distant, so unreachable. But Eris was determined. If they could just show him that someone cared, that would be enough. After what felt like hours of wandering, Eris finally found a large door guarded by 2 royal soldiers. They stood at attention, not letting anyone pass without permission. Eris approached them, their heart racing. "I need to speak with the Emperor," they said, their voice shaky but firm. "I have a gift for him." The soldiers exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. "The Emperor is not receiving anyone today," one of them said. "Especially not children." Eris felt their resolve start to crumble, but they didn't back down. "Please, it's important." The soldiers hesitated. They looked at the small card in Eris's hand, then at each other. Finally, one of them sighed. "Fine, but don't waste the Emperor's time." Eris nodded, their heart pounding as the door was opened. Inside, the Emperor sat on his throne, a massive chair made of obsidian and gold. His figure was larger than life, and his presence seemed to fill the entire room. The Dragon Emperor looked every bit as imposing as the stories had described. His eyes were cold, his face a mask of indifference. He was dressed in flowing robes that glittered with the light of distant stars, and his scales shimmered like liquid metal. His wings were folded behind him, their sheer size dwarfing everything around him. Eris felt small, almost insignificant, standing before him. But they took a deep breath and stepped forward. The Emperor's gaze shifted, his golden eyes narrowing as he looked down at the child before him. For a moment there was silence. "Who are you?" The Emperor's voice boomed, deep and powerful. Eris swallowed hard, their voice trembling. "My name is Eris. I have a gift for you." The Emperor raised an eyebrow. "A gift? Do you think I need any more gifts?" Eris held out the card, their hands shaking. "It's not a treasure or an artifact. It's just a thank you. For everything." The Emperor's eyes flicked to the card. He didn't move, didn't speak. Eris could feel their heart thumping in their chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Emperor reached out and took the card. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting it as if it were a strange object from another world. Eris held their breath. Would he toss it aside like everything else? Would he laugh and mock them for their foolishness? But the Emperor did neither. He stared at the card for a long moment, and then, slowly, his expression softened. It was a subtle change, but it was there. A flicker of something in his eyes, something that hadn't been there for a long time. The Emperor's voice was softer when he spoke again. "A thank you," he said, his tone almost thoughtful. "I haven't received one of those in a long time." Eris didn't know what to say. They had come expecting rejection, expecting the Emperor to throw the card aside just like all the others. But something was different. Something was changing. For the first time in years, the Emperor seemed to notice them. And for the first time in a long time, Eris felt like they had done something important, something that mattered. The palace was silent after Eris handed the Dragon Emperor the simple thank you card. The Emperor sat in his massive throne, his golden eyes fixed on the small, fragile card in his hands. Eris held their breath, unable to move, their heart racing. What would happen now? Would the Emperor throw the card aside like all the other gifts he had rejected in the past? Would he scorn them for their foolishness? But to Eris's surprise, the Emperor didn't speak or move immediately. Instead, he stared at the card for what felt like an eternity. Eris's stomach churned with uncertainty. The Emperor's gaze was intense, like he was seeing through them, looking deep into their soul. Finally, after what felt like hours, the Emperor's deep voice broke the silence. "You have no idea what this means, do you?" Eris was startled. I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. For protecting the Empire." The Emperor slowly raised his eyes to meet Eris's. His expression was still unreadable, but there was something different in the way he looked at them now. It wasn't the cold, distant gaze of a ruler who had grown tired of the world. No, this was something else. It was as if he was finally seeing Eris for who they were, a simple human with nothing to offer except kindness. "You don't understand," the Emperor said quietly. "I haven't been thanked in a long time." Eris was confused. "What do you mean?" "You're the ruler of this empire. Everyone admires you." The Emperor let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Admire me, yes. But they don't see me. They see power, strength, and emperor who cannot be defeated. They don't see the burden I carry, the loneliness that comes with ruling an empire for centuries. Every gift they bring, every word of praise they offer, it's hollow. Eris felt a pang of sympathy. The Emperor, despite all his power, was still a prisoner of his own throne. He had everything, yet nothing at all. Eris's heart softened at the thought. They stepped closer to the Emperor, feeling a new sense of courage rising within them. "You don't have to be alone," Eris said, almost whispering. The Emperor looked down at them, his golden eyes narrowing slightly. "You speak like you understand. But you are just a child, an orphan. What do you know of loneliness?" Eris bit their lip, not backing down. "I know what it's like to feel alone. I grew up without a family, without anyone to care for me. But I never stopped believing that there was kindness in the world, and I believe that deep down you still have that kindness too." For a long moment the Emperor said nothing. His gaze softened, though, just a little. The ice that had surrounded his heart for so long seemed to crack, even if only slightly. It was the first time someone had seen through his armor, someone who wasn't interested in his power but in him as a person. "You are brave, Eris," the Emperor finally said. "No one has ever spoken to me like that." Eris smiled, though their heart was still racing. "I didn't come here to change you. I just wanted to show you that there is still kindness in the universe, even in places you might have forgotten." The Emperor glanced at the card again, turning it over in his hands. It was simple, just paper and ink, a few flowers pressed between its folds. But it had meant something. The Emperor had felt it. The small gesture had pierced through the walls he had built around himself for so many years. "I don't know why this matters," the Emperor murmured, almost to himself. "But it does. I can't remember the last time anyone cared this much about me." Eris's heart swelled. The Emperor had spent so long in his cold palace, surrounded by riches and treasures, that he had forgotten the value of something as simple as a kind word, a gesture of goodwill. But Eris had reminded him of that value. "I didn't expect you to accept it," Eris said, their voice barely a whisper. "But I had to try. Sometimes all it takes is one small act of kindness to change everything." For a moment the Emperor said nothing. He stood up from his throne, his massive form towering over Eris. The room seemed to grow even quieter as the Emperor slowly approached them. "You are the first to show me such kindness," the Emperor said, his voice low and almost hesitant. "Perhaps there is more to this universe than just power." Eris looked up at him, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and uncertainty. "What do you mean?" The Emperor's golden eyes gleamed, but there was no anger in them. "I have lived for centuries, watched empires rise and fall, seen wars and peace, betrayal and loyalty. I have known power, but never have I known true connection. Perhaps it is time for that to change." The words were heavy and they hung in the air like a promise. Eris didn't fully understand what the Emperor meant, but they knew one thing for sure. The Emperor had changed. That cold, distant ruler who had rejected everything in his path, he was no longer the same. The small, simple card had done what no gift or treasure had ever been able to accomplish. It had reached the Emperor's heart. Eris didn't know what the future held, but they felt a sense of hope they had never known before. They had given the Emperor something no one else had dared to give, something real. And in return, the Emperor was beginning to see that there was more to life than just power. "I can't promise you I will change overnight," the Emperor said, his voice softening even more. "But perhaps I can try. For the first time in many years, I will try." Eris nodded, feeling a sense of warmth spreading through them. That's all anyone can ask for. The Emperor studied Eris for a moment longer, then looked down at the card once more. "You may not have a family, Eris, but you are not alone. Not anymore." Eris felt a lump form in their throat. The Emperor had just given them the one thing they had longed for, the feeling that they were seen, that they mattered. "Thank you," Eris said, their voice full of gratitude. "Thank you for listening." The Emperor nodded slowly. "And thank you for showing me that kindness still exists even in the darkest of places." For the first time in years, the Emperor allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The days following the conversation between Eris and the Dragon Emperor were filled with a quiet but significant change. The palace, once filled with an air of cold formality, now felt different. The Emperor no longer remained in his chambers for hours on end, surrounded by his treasures and his thoughts. Instead, he began spending more time walking the gardens, conversing with his advisors and even reaching out to the people of the empire. Eris was by his side during many of these moments, quietly offering their thoughts and ideas. Their presence, though still humble and simple, had become important. The Emperor had begun to trust Eris more than he had trusted anyone in centuries. Their bond, once formed through a simple thank you card, had grown into something much deeper, a mutual respect, born not of power or duty but of genuine connection. One afternoon, as the Emperor and Eris sat together on the balcony overlooking the Empire, the Emperor turned to them with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I never thought it would be possible," he said, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. "To change, to open up, to see the world differently." Eris smiled gently. "I think you just needed someone to remind you. It's easy to forget, especially when you've been carrying everything alone for so long." The Emperor nodded, his golden eyes reflecting a sense of realization. "I have spent so many years believing that my strength was the only thing that mattered. But now I see that true strength lies not in power, but in the ability to connect with others, to be vulnerable, to care for those around you." Eris was silent for a moment, letting the Emperor's words settle in the quiet space between them. It was a remarkable shift, one that no one could have predicted. The Emperor, once a ruler feared across the galaxy, had started to understand what it meant to be a true leader. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about wealth. It was about the people he ruled and the relationships he built. The Emperor turned to Eris, his voice now filled with a quiet sincerity. "You have changed me, Eris. I was lost and you found me. And because of you, I will never be the same." Eris felt a warmth spread through them at the Emperor's words. They had never expected such a transformation when they first decided to offer the Emperor their card. They had simply wanted to show him a small kindness, but in doing so, they had unlocked something deep within him. And now they stood at the beginning of a new chapter, one where the Emperor wasn't just a ruler but a man who understood the true meaning of leadership. But the change wasn't just in the Emperor. As news of his newfound perspective spread through the palace, whispers began to reach the Empire's far corners. People who had once feared the Emperor now spoke of him with respect, not just as a ruler but as a leader who had finally begun to understand his people. His advisors, once concerned only with power, began to notice his softer approach to decision-making. The Emperor was no longer a figurehead who ignored the needs of his people. He listened, he cared, and in turn, the Empire began to change. In the weeks that followed, the Emperor ordered changes to the way the Empire was governed. He no longer made decisions alone, shutting himself away in his chambers. Instead, he involved his people in discussions, listening to their concerns and taking their needs into account. He visited distant worlds in his empire, not as a ruler demanding tribute, but as a leader coming to understand the lives of his people. And through it all, Eris was by his side. They had become the Emperor's closest confidant, trusted with the Emperor's thoughts and doubts. But more than that, Eris had become his friend, a friend who had shown him the value of compassion, of community, and of the simple, powerful act of listening. One day, as the Emperor stood on the balcony overlooking the capital city, watching as the people went about their daily lives, he turned to Eris with a look of quiet satisfaction. "It's strange," the Emperor said, his voice softer than before. "For the first time in my life, I feel as though I am truly part of this empire. Not as a ruler above them, but as someone who is a part of their lives." Eris nodded. "That's the way it's supposed to be. A leader who is connected to their people is the strongest kind of leader. You've always been the Emperor, but now you're more than that. You're someone they can trust." The Emperor smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You have shown me that strength isn't just about power. It's about understanding, about empathy, and about the willingness to change." Eris felt a surge of pride. "I'm glad you see that. I never wanted you to feel alone. I just wanted to remind you of the person you could still be." The Emperor stood a little taller as he looked out over the city, his gaze steady. "And I see it now. I see it all." It was at that moment that the Emperor realized something else, something deeper. The true power of his empire wasn't in the grand palaces or the glittering treasures. It wasn't in the armies or the vast wealth that had once defined him. It was in the people. It was in the connections he had begun to build, in the relationships he had formed, and in the kindness that had started to spread throughout the empire. The empire was not just a collection of worlds and people under his rule. It was a living, breathing force, united by the shared desire to live in peace and harmony. Eris had been the key to unlocking that truth. Their simple thank you card had opened the Emperor's eyes to a world beyond power and control, a world where kindness, understanding, and empathy could rule just as strongly as any army. For the first time in a long time, the Emperor felt hope for the future. His empire was not just a kingdom built on fear. It was a kingdom built on respect and trust, on the connection between the ruler and the ruled. And it was because of Eris that this change had come. "I was wrong," the Emperor said, his voice filled with quiet emotion. "All these years I thought I knew what was best for the Empire. But I was wrong. The best thing I can do is listen to my people, to understand them and to lead them with compassion." Eris smiled, their heart full of hope. "You're doing just that." And that's all anyone could ask for. And so a new era began. The Dragon Emperor, once a figure of solitude and power, had become a true leader, one who ruled not with fear but with love and understanding. The Empire, under his guidance, flourished in ways it never had before. As for Eris, the orphan who had once walked the streets of the capital with nothing, they had become someone important, someone who had shown the Emperor the value of kindness and compassion. Eris had given the Emperor a gift, and in return they had helped change the future of the entire empire. Together, they stood at the start of something new, something brighter, something filled with hope.